Established by the Saxons more than 1,000 years ago, Guildford has grown to become the county town of Surrey, and today is home to 66,000 people, and a fair few ghosts and spirits if the tales are to be believed. Intrigued by reports from so-called eyewitnesses and tales I've overheard in pubs and inns, I'm going in search of Guildford's most chilling ghost stories. To do this, I require the help of a local expert, and he comes in the form of author and actor Philip Hutchinson, who invites me to put on a brave face and join him on a ghost tour of Guildford. Eagle. So here we are in the great chamber at Guildford Castle. And Philip, this room now looks quite bland and sparse. I can't really imagine that this was once the king's accommodation. Tell me a little about Guildford Castle.
The castle here, it's now getting on for 1,000 years old. It was founded straight after the Norman invasion of 1066. But the keep that we're in, it's about 900 years old. It was built in 2 stages. The castle was originally set up here to control the Saxons of Guildford following the battle to ensure they didn't fight back, but it was quite a benign area and it never happened, so quickly afterwards it was turned into a royal palace.
So Philip, now this castle, as you mentioned there, had quite a tranquil history in as far as it was never besieged or stormed. So what kind of hauntings could arise from such a peaceful setting?
Conversely, although this place was never fought over, it did serve as the county prison for Surrey and Sussex for 300 years. And the majority of people staying here were awaiting execution the following morning. Executions were held somewhere within the castle grounds. We have no idea where, but it's just a logical thing that would have taken place. Later on, they held them in the high street and up on the mount, but in early medieval times, they were certainly held within here. People have claimed they've seen a man chained up to the walls on the ground floor. They claim he appears to be a monk. Now, when people say they're seeing monks or nuns, what they're often seeing is someone just wearing medieval garb. It was a standard wear, but we tend to associate it with ecclesiastics these days. We're now outside the great keep, Alex. You see from the bottom here just how tall it looks. We've gone down a steep slope. It looks pretty imposing. It's great at night when it's all lit up. The gardens here are beautiful at any time of year. They're award-winning. And the gardeners, we have 2 full-time gardeners here. A lot of other temps are brought in. It's concerning the gardeners to which these 2 extra stories relate. One of the gardeners here, he doesn't believe in ghosts. And it's fair enough. And it's often the people who don't believe in ghosts who then tell you things they've seen. Now, they're not putting it down to ghosts. They're just saying, I don't know what it was. But there has been many occasions over the years here. They tend to come into work very early, often before dawn, to have the gardens ready. Obviously, when they have to water the grass in the summer, you can't have the hoses trailing everywhere, so they come in really early to do it all. And often around the paths around the keep and going down to the fish pond on the other side of it, he's seen a woman wearing a brown Victorian dress walking down the paths towards him. He's never noticed her face, and I questioned him further about it. He says, well, she just doesn't seem to have one. He's gone to speak to her, and she's just walked past and disappeared. There'd been another time he was trying to lock up here at night, and he saw this woman in the Victorian brown dress standing at the top of the motte, and he went up to tell her it's time to leave because he was locking up, and got up here, and she wasn't there.
Eagle. So down and around from the castle, here we are in Guildford Museum. Now, Philip, I believe the tales that surround this building are to do with a musical instrument, which has never actually been here during its time as a museum. Tell me about that.
That's right. Number 48 Quarry Street, which is now part of the whole museum structure. It covers several buildings that have all been linked together. It was, in Victorian times, a girls' school. And the story has it, I've never found any evidence that it's true, so it could just be legend, that the music teacher had hanged herself in the music room, which was at the top front of number 48. And people have just, the story had just gone down in local legend, disappeared entirely. And then it came back with a vengeance in the 90s. We had a caretaker here at the time. Now, the rooms directly underneath those particular offices, there used to be a caretaker's flat. They've now been converted. They're not anymore. But he was staying there with his girlfriend, and they had a guest to stay overnight. They put them in the spare room, and the next morning asked them if they'd had a good night's sleep. And they claimed they hadn't, because they'd been kept awake by someone playing a piano in the room above them all night, which is the actual room in question. It's been heard by staff as well. Some of the staff here that have now retired had their offices in that wing of the building. and they'd heard the piano being played, and they'd open the windows to see where the music was coming from, and when they opened the window, then the music would stop, so they'd shut the window, then it would start playing again. One of the ex-staff here had recognised the piece as being one of Chopin's impromptus, which would have actually kind of fitted in with the period. It certainly wasn't written after the time. It was a score that the piece that he heard had been written when the music teacher had supposedly been here. They'd been working in that wing of the building as well when they'd heard feet going up and down the staircase. Likewise, in the caretaker's flat, there was a particularly spooky event. The caretaker himself was working away from the museum on business, and his girlfriend was left in the flat by herself, and she was in the bedroom, and she heard feet walking through the kitchen, which is the back entrance of the old flat, and then walk into the tiny lobby area. And then when she was in the bedroom bedroom door handle turned, the door opened about 15 centimetres, then the door slowly closed again, and the feet, she heard the feet just walk through the locked door leading to the upper floors of the museum. Also in the room where the suicide supposedly occurred, the lady who was also now left the service, who used to work here, she had been in the office at 2 PM when there was a massive crash from the empty attic space above her. Nothing to have caused it.
Eagle.
So, apart from having this very comfy leather sofa, Philip, the King's Head is known as the most haunted building in Guildford. Why?
It's because pubs accrue a lot of comings and goings over the years. People have come and gone in the past, people are come and going in the present, and in the present it certainly means they can bear witness to anything paranormal that's going on. This building has medieval origins. It's built on top of a medieval structure. Restoration work done here after the ceiling caved in the 90s showed the building here had once been used as a cobbler shop. There's a possibility too, this was once a corner wall of the palace, Guildford Castle, which is really only a stone's throw from here. The structures we're in now, it's 2 old Tudor cottages that have been knocked through into one. It became a pub in the 18th century. But the hauntings here tend to be more recent. There's nothing ancient here. Things have happened from the 80s onwards, at least tangible stories. There'd always been rumours of ghosts beforehand. But the landlord had moved out in the 80s. The head barman had remained. A new landlord moved in. And the outgoing landlord said there was something unusual about the pub and it might be haunted. And the head barman said, this is all nonsense. But in 1987, when the head barman was calling time at the bar, he actually froze and he'd seen an old woman standing at the wall opposite the bar. She was grey and indistinct. She was just staring straight at him. Shortly after this, the pub dog went berserk and started barking at a spot in the far corner when you enter the structure. Because that door once led down into the cellar, and it's been blocked up now. In the cellar as well, you can see where the old doorway was. It's now been bricked up. In that cellar, a lone female voice has been known to call members of staff by their Christian names. They've gone down to see who it was, and there's been no one there. The thing that's seen most often these days, I've not been aware of any experiences for a few years now, but certainly going back no more than about 10 years, staff started seeing a little girl who was wearing a white lacy Victorian dress who'd stand at the entrance, then start skipping through the pub and disappear through the French windows at the back, and they started calling her Mary just to give her a name. I did have a woman on the ghost tour 10 years ago, and she'd been standing on the top step next to me as I was telling the story, and when I mentioned Mary's name, she'd actually jumped off the step, and I thought it was just joking. But she claimed that when I said her name, she'd actually felt a small, cold hand shove her leg out of the way.
So you mentioned there that some of the hauntings are more recent. Have there ever been instances in history in our area where, say, the Saxons were bothered by the Romans, or the Romans by, moving back into history? Because a lot of our hauntings seem to focus on the Middle Ages.
That's true. The earliest account I found of an apparition being seen in Guildford was from the late 17th century. There had been a gentleman had been murdered on one of the high roads leading out of town, probably the Epsom or London roads out of town, and his murderers had been captured, and they denied they'd done anything, and they were put in Guildford's House of Correction to await the assizes coming and their trial. The House of Correction was actually at the bottom of High Street, where the statue of the Surrey Scholar is now. The building's just behind that's where the prison used to be. There have been several prisons there over the years. But there was a third felon had been incarcerated in the cell with them. And he woke up overnight and claimed he'd seen an old man standing over the two sleeping men who'd been arrested for this murder. And he described him in detail. He said he'd been ripped up the front of his body, he was holding his back in agony, and he described his facial features, what the clothes he was wearing. And he was brought before a relative of the murdered man the next day who said, this is the man who's been murdered. And when they heard this, the felons actually admitted to the crime. And that story was related in a book by Joseph Glanville, who was a very famous writer on the paranormal in the 17th century.
Eagle.
So we stood in Angel Gate, in a passageway which would have been used to take the horses back to the stables. But that's not what brings us here. A report from a James Bond actor caught my attention. Tell me about what happened to Roger Moore when he stayed at the Angel Hotel.
Roger Moore was filming around Guildford area in 1973, and he was staying in the Prince Imperial of France room, which is just over the top of this archway in which we're standing right now. The first night he stayed there, he woke in the early hours of the morning to find the room was icily cold, and there was a shadowy shape of a man walking straight through the locked door towards his bed. And being Roger Moore, and one of our most famous James Bonds, he asked him, they asked the figure, who are you, what do you want, can I help, are you in need of anything? And of course the figure did nothing at all, and disappeared. And the second night he stayed there, it happened again. This figure walked through the doorway and up towards him, and he didn't say anything this night. This night he felt that the ghost was somehow malevolent, probably because it had been slighted by being ignored the previous night. But when he woke up after the third night's sleep there, in which nothing happened at all, he found the room's Bible open at his bedside, open at the 23rd Psalm, which is "The Lord is my shepherd." And when the maid came to clean his room that morning, she asked if he'd been disturbed by the ghost the previous night. Now, Roger Moore was pretty surprised, because he hadn't told anyone about what he'd actually seen. But he said that he hadn't been, and it was at that point she pointed down to the Bible at the bedside and said, "No, I didn't think you would be. I left it open there because he doesn't like that one."
How peculiar, how peculiar. Well, the building here is built on a much older site. In fact, the oldest part of the establishment dates to the 1300s under our feet. Which brings me on then to some of the other stories about the Angel Hotel before Roger Moore was here. Tell me about those.
The really famous one happened on the 31st of January 1970, again relating to Room 1. Now, it's easy to say Room 1's a haunted one. I think a great deal of the rooms in the Angel are meant to be haunted. The chefs have had things fly across the kitchen. The maids in other rooms have had people talk to them. They felt walls closing in around them. All sorts of things have happened. But the big famous one, as I say, is from 1970. And Mr. Dell from Bayswater in London was in the restaurant with his wife, and beckoned the manager to him to tell him what had happened the early hours of that morning when they too had been staying in Room 1. Mr. Dell had woken up. He'd had pretty bad indigestion. They were staying in Guildford on a long weekend break, and they'd overdone the evening meal. So after decided that he wasn't going to get much sleep that night, he propped himself up in an armchair overlooking the high street, and he'd just glance around the room occasionally. And once when he was doing this, his eyes passed by a large wardrobe which had a large mirror upon it. And staring back at him from behind the mirror, he saw a Eastern European soldier wearing a uniform of the mid-19th century with a huge moustache, was just staring back at him from behind the mirror. And he stared at it for a few minutes to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Then he woke his wife, and she saw it too. And over the following 20 minutes that followed, he sketched the figure that was staring in front, staring back at them, just motionless, not disappearing anything at all, not moving. And he sketched it down on a napkin, which has been reproduced in many books now. And after a full half hour had elapsed, this figure just slowly faded away before their eyes again. It was seen again years later. In 1979, the actress and singer Petula Clark was acting at the Yvonne Arnaud Theatre here in Guildford, and she too was staying in Room 1, and she also saw the same soldier looking back at her from behind the mirror. That wardrobe has now been dismantled, lying somewhere on a landfill site probably. In 1985, the Angel had a refit pending being sold on by the Trust House Forte Group, and a lot of the furnishings were scrapped, and one of the things that went away to be wrecked was the wardrobe from Room 1, and they've not seen the soldier since.
So could it have just been an image in the glass?
There has been a theory of that some people have thought there could be some kind of strange prism refraction coming through with moonlight through the room, and you could be seeing an image that was behind the glass of the mirror, and it's somehow going through the silver backing of the mirror, and that's what you're seeing. But we'll never know.
The station that loves Surrey and Hampshire. Eagle Radio.